So let's get there, come along now, and I'll wear my Russian shirt. Now let's raise our fists together, and let's have someone get hurt. Okay, they got the money back, we have got the looks. Okay, they got the money back, we have better books we actually read. It's a vacuum, but they need you. Let's found the bourgeoisie. We are happy and you can't be. Let's found the bourgeoisie and come with me.
This is Radical Minds on WHPK 88.5 FM Chicago, the pride of the South Side. Radical Minds explores the intersection between politics and economics in the modern world, where an ongoing discussion among activists, academics, and intellectuals on issues pertinent to the left, past, present, and future. Radical Minds broadcasts on alternating Tuesdays right here on WHPK from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I'm your host, Greg Gabrellis. Radical Minds is pleased to air an interview from September 2011 with Cary Nelson. Cary Nelson is Professor of English and Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's also the current president of the American Association of University Professors and a prominent scholar activist. His latest book is No University is an Island, Saving Academic Freedom, published in 2010 by New York University Press. Cary, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Nice to be here.
So I first wanted to ask you about your background in the politics of the 1960s and 70s when you first began teaching. The 1960s and 70s were the high watermark of politics on the left in America since pretty much the 1930s. How did the concerns of this period become transformed in your intellectual work? How does it continue to inform your work down through the present day?
I think in many ways that activism predates my identity as a faculty member. I was an undergraduate at Antioch College, 1963 to 1967, and my undergraduate 4 years were punctuated by Vietnam demonstrations, mostly in Washington, D.C., although early in 1964, the Antioch College president called a campus-wide meeting and said, I'm ashamed of the students, I'm ashamed of the faculty. I thought you'd be protesting the Vietnam War much more vigorously. What's the matter with you? And I thought, gee, university presidents are great guys. I've been sort of looking for another one like that for the last 40 years. But within a few months, a group of us were in a huge football stadium in Columbus, Ohio, and we sort of snuck in and interrupted Lyndon Johnson's speech. He was president at the time. Chanting, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Still my favorite chant. And Secret Service agents wrestled us to the ground and hustled us out. And that was my second year at Antioch. And after that, I was in Washington, D.C. repeatedly. I had been there as a high school student in my senior year to hear Martin Luther King give his famous I Have a Dream speech. So being part of large groups that feel some political solidarity and are taking action together has really been part of my life for a long time. When I went to graduate school, of course, that was 67 to 70, demonstrations continued. I was at the University of Rochester where there were demonstrations against Dow Chemical, and of course there were still continuing demonstrations in D.C. When I began to teach in 1970, one of the first courses that I taught was contemporary American poetry, and by then I was, I had heard Allen Ginsberg read Wichita Vortex Sutra at Antioch College. I heard him read its poems in a demonstration in front of the United Nations. So when I began teaching the anti-Vietnam War poetry that I had heard read out loud, I was now talking about with students in a classroom. So there was really no hiatus, just a different setting and a different way of thinking through the relationship between politics and culture, now doing it in a classroom. Then, in circumstances that I will never entirely understand, as a second-year faculty member, age 25, there was a an early move toward unionization on my own campus. It's in fact, that's the only drive that's been at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the last 40 years. We're about to start another one now, 40 years later. But the Teamsters International contacted me as a second-year assistant professor and asked me if I would represent them in a drive on campus. And I thought that that was a fairly entertaining prospect, although it would not be the best advice to a young assistant professor that one could give to represent Teamsters International. But I did. We had a campaign. It came actually very close to winning. So I was, teaching politically inflected poetry, doing a union organizing campaign on campus. All of these things have just always been part of my life.
What about the earlier intellectual work that you did, specifically attempting to renew Marxian theory? What was the relationship between your political involvement and your turn to theory as a scholar and an intellectual?
Well, I've always felt strongly that one of the areas of necessary theorization that we have overlooked to our loss has been higher education itself. And I found that some of the cultural studies work that Marxist theorists were doing, especially in Britain, really helped understand not only contemporary American political life, but specifically the dynamics of political life on the university campus. And, faculty members historically have been loath to reflect on their own activities, to reflect on their own institutional positioning. And more as time goes on, especially now in the 21st century, Americans are paying a real price for the failure of faculty and students to think about the politics and of their own institutions and to begin to theorize the workplace, the university workplace, in partly Marxist terms. So that's been a kind of interest and involvement in Marxist theory has helped me, I think, understand who I am and where I am situated in a given institution. Without it, I just don't think that would be possible. It's also, I think, throughout that whole period of time, when I and some other people were working to bring, especially British cultural studies and post-structuralist Marxism to the campus, there was a strong sense, I think, that we had little chance of understanding the dynamics of American political life without that kind of theoretical base. And why is it that Americans historically vote against their own best interests? Why is it that they accept a workplace life that's often disheartening and destructive? I think that a kind of post-structuralist Marxism, which recognizes that nothing is guaranteed, that cultural forms are unstable, plural, and are stitched together in new ways constantly, helps you begin to deal with the practical realities of American political life, which otherwise can be somewhat inexplicable.
One of your passages in your recent book says, and I quote, "Theory has powerfully pervaded literary studies, history, and the foreign languages, but been little applied to the profession itself. We celebrated the new feminism while destroying women's lives. We investigated Marxism while expanding our own exploited proletariat. We democratized our annual conventions and curricula while acting like plantation overseers in our own workplaces." How do you assess, in retrospect, the political impact of the emergence of academic theory in the 70s and 80s, the kinds of theory that you and your colleagues wish to bring over and to see flower on American institutions of higher education? How do you assess the legacy of this moment, both in terms of creating new research programs, but also as really being able to inform politics on the left today?
Well, it's interesting, a number of the folks in Britain and France, certainly, whom we drew on and who actually we brought to the Champaign Urbana campus from time to time, all of them always sort of astonished that such a place even existed. I still remember Henri Lefebvre in a moment of frustration saying, I cannot believe what cheap wine you American Marxists drink.
At U of I.
At the U of I, right. There was a certain culture shock for them in coming there repeatedly. But I think a lot of those folks didn't make a separation between the theoretical work that they were doing, the practical daily life that they had in various institutions, and political life in their communities. These things were stitched together in their lives. And I think in many ways that was very hard to transfer to an American context, especially because, since the 1970s, the sort of models of faculty identity have been viciously careerist. I mean, people look after their own vitas, they look after their own interests, they have very little public commitment, very little community commitment. I think that's beginning to change. Whether it's really a belated effect of theory or not, I doubt. I mean, I think in part it's beginning to change because circumstances are forcing it, because new identities for faculty members are being crafted by the graduate student union organizing movement, which leads people to have lives that include both research and teaching, their own private work, but also some sense of commitment to a community. I mean, that's part of what made possible the effort at Chicago, I guess earlier this year, or maybe it was late last year. I think earlier this year, when the university was going to outsource housekeepers and see them, be reduced to minimum wage, watch them lose their health care and retirement benefits in the standard way that happens when you outsource real jobs and create fake jobs. I think that the graduate student organizers were amongst the groups that I think really got involved in trying to protect those other community members. And that, to me, is a proper sort of organic application of theory, an understanding of justice, an understanding of workplace solidarity, to the life that you're actually living. That took a long time. In the passage that you read, part of what I'm doing is really castigating the large elements of the theory movement of the 1970s for failing to apply it to material circumstances in their own situation. And I think that was one of the losses of high theory, which was distinctly American. I mean, you didn't find, if you went to Calcutta, you wouldn't find high theory operating in such radical detachment from daily life. You wouldn't find it in France. You wouldn't find it in many ways in Britain. But you found it in the United States. It was something particular to this cultural matrix that let theory with implications about social life and theory that directly addressed social life sort of live out its existence without noticing the world around it.
Now, there were many different ways in which the left in the 1970s attempt to basically put theory into action, and probably one of the most overtly political ways, as practiced by groups that formed what was called the New Communist Movement, for example, was to form a political party and then attempt to basically win the masses over to the revolutionary struggle. How do you distinguish your own interpretation of applying theory to material circumstances from that practiced by political Marxists contemporaneous to your own work?
Well, I think some of those movements are not within the university. They're really outside it. Mm-hmm. There have been, even up until the present day, I think the Labor Party is a significant movement, at least in some states. It's not all across the country, but here and there, they're, I think, doing some public education and some organizing that's really important. And I've certainly been tempted by it myself, but at the moment I've got this gig that keeps me pretty busy as AAUP president, or actually busy until the point of exhaustion a good deal of the time. It's typically 10 hours a day. So I've had some contact with those movements, but I absolutely, have not been able to devote myself to them. But what I've made a sort of practical commitment to the university as, my popular movement commitment as my social space to try to work with transforming it and saving it. I think the failure to reflect on institutions by the people who live in them and work in them now partly means that the social impact of higher education is deteriorating. Tuition goes up, more and more children of the poor can't afford higher education. I'm a believer in the notion that education as a whole can save people, and that it is really the only way to move up any kind of social ladder, and that it has a transformative force for the lives of ordinary people, and a desperately needed one for the poor, but they're being shut out increasingly. I think that both political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, aren't really interested in access to higher education. I think most of the corporate world would like to see higher education dumbed down. They don't want workers who are critical and reflective about the workplace. They want docile workers. And I think more and more there's pressure on the university to produce that kind of workforce, people who won't complain, people who won't think, people who won't take issue with the worlds in which they live. So I think higher education as a socially transformative force is at risk, and I think it's critically important to be involved in the politics of higher education and the sort of social consequences of what we do, and the social consequences of funding being lost, money being frittered away on many things rather than education, even within universities. So that's kind of where my life is devoted at this point. Do I think that the real political history of third parties in the United States through much of the 20th century is not hopeful? The odds of actually winning elections are often pretty small. The work that they can do is to educate people. The work is consciousness raising. That's the form of political organization, and I think it's vital that some people be involved in it.
And now for a break.
Hi, I'm Olympic figure skater Peggy Fleming. Achieving better health through physical activity doesn't have to be an Olympic effort. I get a lot of my exercise by chasing around my 3 young grandsons. Family is important to me. I lost my father and sister to heart disease. That's why I've teamed up with the American Heart Association's START initiative to spread the word about physical activity, like brisk walking. Join me and get moving today. Visit startwalkingnow.org.
And now back to our interview with Cary Nelson, author of the book No University is an Island, Saving Academic Freedom. At the turn of the century, a American sociologist named Thorstein Veblen wrote a book called The Higher Learning in America, A Study in Total Depravity. And since then, American social critics seem to have all feel obliged to point out that American universities have not been bastions of academic freedom, that in fact academic freedom is something of a myth that universities tell themselves in order to get along and maintain their presence. I can name a book by Richard Hofstadter that came out in the 1950s during the McCarthy period. Also, of course, Christopher Lasch's work, The Agony of the American Left. Where do you date the beginning of I guess, the current phase of the movement to redeem higher education? And what is the relationship between the contemporary movement to save higher ed in relation to the long American history of criticizing higher learning?
First of all, I think, since you invoke that historical trajectory, I don't think it's quite universally or broadly or comprehensively true that there really has been no academic freedom, as I understand it, in higher education. I think, obviously, during the McCarthy period, it was compromised severely. It was compromised conceivably even worse during World War I, when there was a much more relentless, repressive, apparatus in place. So it's certainly had periods where a kind of aggression against academic freedom has penetrated daily life at the university. The way in which academic freedom has survived, I think, pretty strongly for the last 50 years, has been, for the most part, that when you're in your classroom teaching, there isn't someone else sitting in there conducting surveillance. In other words, I think people have had a high degree of freedom, for the most part, for a long time, in how and what they teach. And they've had, I think, a lot of freedom choosing their own research subjects, that is, picking things that they are passionate about and that they want to work on. It's really those two areas of university life that I think have mostly been protected from the imposition of various kinds of rules, regulative behaviors, accounting procedures, and so forth. There are exceptions to that, and the exceptions over the last 30 years in some ways have begun to grow, and over the last 10 years in a different way have begun to grow. Over the last 30 years, what's happened is that higher education has increasingly relied on contingent workers, part-time teachers who are paid slave wages and who often have much less or no academic freedom because they can be fired. They're at-will employees. They cannot be renewed the next semester. Indeed, firing a part-time faculty member, even firing is a misnomer. They just don't get a new contract. So it's not even an event. It's something that doesn't happen. They're not rehired. And those folks feel constrained in their teaching. They tell me over and over again they sometimes avoid assigning controversial books because they don't want to get their students angry. They don't want to get their students' parents angry. I mean, most tenured faculty members have never even asked themselves a question like that. Do I put myself in danger by assigning a book that people will get upset about? You might be more inclined to look for books that will get a classroom excited and volatile. So I think that change in higher education, which has been massive, really has undercut academic freedom. The other change, which is mounted over the last decade and is going to get much, much worse unless we find ways of dealing with it, is the increasing reliance on corporate funding for scientific research. So that scientists, who entered academia thinking that they were going to be in charge of their own lives to a significant degree, are now under a lot of pressure to do the research that will produce the most profit from a given corporation. With federal funding in decline and peer-reviewed grants in decline for 20 years, corporate grants are becoming more and more common, and they're often oriented toward product research, right? I mean, it's not theoretical science, it's what can you produce for the marketplace. And that's really taking away scientists' academic freedom in ways that we really haven't experienced before in the country, that they are basically becoming, in a sense, they're not even university employees anymore. University pays their salary, but they're really under the direction of some pretty rapacious American and international corporations. And that's a really terrifying development in higher education. So, humanities faculty members are either losing their academic freedom because they're losing their jobs. Academic freedom doesn't mean a lot if you're not employed. I guess you can exercise it in the supermarket, but that's not too powerful. Or they're losing their academic freedom because they're vulnerable contingent employees who are at-will employees that can be fired at a moment's notice. And scientists, science departments are not being closed down. They're not being downsized because I think there's strong public awareness of the potential benefits of science research. But science research is being directed more and more into crude forms of product development, so that there are especially many young scientists sort of seeking tenure discover themselves not to be leading the lives they thought they were leading. Mm-hmm. They were entering this, to explore their intellectual passions, and instead they're trying to develop widgets to be in the marketplace. So those things, those influences, are really powerfully undercutting academic freedom. But I think we went through several decades after the Second World War, during the huge rise of the mega university in the 1960s and beyond, in which research and teaching were largely free from interference, and in that domain, at least, academic freedom worked. The history of it working in terms of institutional governance is much more fragile. I mean, you might reasonably argue that faculty members in many institutions have no say in the running of their institutions at all, or precious little say in the running of their institutions, save in the two areas that the AAUP identified in 1915, which is control over your teaching and control over your research. And that includes faculty control over who gets hired to do the teaching. That, I think, worked for many decades. It's all coming apart now.
You mentioned the post-war period as marking an expansion in American higher education systems. Yet a criticism from Christopher Lasch in the 60s was that with the decline of a repressive apparatus regulating intellectual production in the universities, there became instead a self-regulation, a self-censorship carried out by members of the faculty themselves. To what extent do you feel like this has been an actual threat to scholarly and potentially politically committed scholarly inquiry in the period following the Second World War?
Well, most forms of cultural repression operate through self-censorship. I mean, even if you look historically, if you look at Germany in World War I, I'm accepting the Nazi era, but if you look at Germany in World War I, it was a pretty controlled society, and most of that was accomplished by people controlling themselves and suppressing their own impulses, basically self-censorship. And I think certainly self-censorship has a strong role in conformity in higher education. And, but it's a much stronger force now, I think, than it was in the 60s and 70s. And especially, in the context of the era of war protests, there was a certain feeling that you could do anything and get away with it. I mean, it just was, self-censorship was a lot less a feature of, I think, academic life than it is now. It's really, I think at this point in time, the primary emotion amongst faculty members on American campuses is fear. Fear rules people's lives, and it does produce dramatic self-censorship. I think, one sees more willingness to conform after September 11th and in the wake of the national security culture that has begun in some ways to permeate higher education. I think that's inculcating a greater impulse, an inclination towards self-censorship. So I think it is now increasingly a problem. The kind of self-censorship that existed, in the 60s and the 70s was, if anything, conformity to disciplinary paradigms. And you have a fundamental question of whether academics have been willing to question their disciplinary paradigms in a really major and aggressive way. And I think, that's been sort of, you could think of that as a form of self-censorship. And it was real in the 1960s, and it's been real in different ways ever since then. Obviously, there have been exceptions. The Black Studies movement questioned discipline severely. The feminist movement put a lot of pressure on academic disciplines. But a lot of high theory didn't. I mean, there's no real tradition of psychoanalytic theory being devoted to the university and turned on the university. And obviously it could have been. In some settings, it's certainly in Britain, Marxist theory has been turned on the university. It's a lens through which people look at university life. But there's significant bodies of theory in this country that actually avoided doing that. And I think that's a form of self-censorship, at least of intellectual self-censorship.
Well, let's consider the intellectual insurgents, and for a moment, specifically movements like Black Power and its entrance into the academy in the form of Black Studies. In an article from 1994, speaking of your attempt to include more radical poets in the canon, you write that putting the left at the center of her work, then, even by deliberate act of will, can eventually force seismic shifts everywhere else in the cultural landscape. But given the way in which, especially the period after the New Left has developed, the Reagan Revolution and the rise of the New Right, to put it in as simple terms as possible, how would you evaluate, say, the impulse to use intellectual work as an effective way to actually transform society.
Well, I must say that hearing that quote now, I feel myself as having suffered a foolishly utopian moment at that moment at my computer. Obviously, at this point, it's hard to think other than darkly about the future of the country. We face the possibility of, a vicious moron becoming president of the United States. That's hardly hopeful. We see an electorate that often votes against its own best interests. I like to say that I'm pretty sure there are people who voted for George Bush out of various forms of cultural hysteria. It's more important to avoid homosexual marriage than it is, to have workplace rules enforced. I mean, people bought into pathological cultural imperatives and basically put their lives at risk. How many people who voted for George Bush are now dead because of it? I mean, it's a real question. But, he could look good compared to Rick Perry. If Rick Perry gets in there, you could be nostalgic for the George Bush days, a thought which is really horrific. So, I mean, what I know that the left has been able to do in higher education is transform the consciousness of some of our students and get them to lead committed lives which are really centered around left intellectual commitments. But any hope that I had that would spread dramatically to the culture as a whole, I think, is going to have to wait another 100 years if any of us are still around then. I mean, it's that particular passage. I usually don't disavow my work, but I think that there's a kind of hope there that I can't say that I feel at the moment.
You're listening to Radical Minds on WHPK 88.5 FM Chicago, the pride of the South Side. One of the points that you mentioned earlier today was that the higher education system has fallen victim to the set of social politics and policies broadly labeled as neoliberalism. But if that's the case, then doesn't that suggest that the problems facing higher education today are symptoms of a wider social and political trend? And moreover, if that's the case, then to what extent would professional politics based around organizing the institutions themselves, actually be able to adequately deal with the problem?
Well, if you mean fully deal with the problem, forget about it. Obviously, public higher education is being progressively defunded by states all across the country. The American public seems to believe that it's much better to incarcerate the poor than to educate them, throw them in jail, don't educate them and give them alternatives in their lives. So there are external forces, very powerful ones, increasingly, that are going to have tremendously negative impact on American campuses. I mean, an institution like a university, at best, has a certain relative autonomy. It has some capacity to make choices, to govern some aspects of its life. If the university has X number of dollars in the bank, it can decide how to spend them to a considerable degree. It has sufficient relative autonomy to make a budget and to decide whether that budget means that the university will be a fair workplace, that will encourage student enrollment. I mean, we can't control the culture at large, and we will be damaged by conservative political movements in the country as a whole. But there are areas in which we can take some control over our own institutional existence. So it's a give and take process where you win what you can. But I think not to make those internal efforts is to cede the whole industry to either mindless downgraded education or various forms of elitism.
So what relationship do you see between the unionization of higher ed and the rest of the left-wing political movement?
Well, a painful question since I'm involved in it. Unions in their founding days are often founded with people who are committed to a cause, who have a mission, who see unionization and organizing within their own industry as a way of seeking social transformation, seeking progressive change in the society as a whole. They look to have an impact not just on their institutions, but on their communities. They look to have alliances with other organized industries outside higher education. That, I think, is integral to the founding of many union movements in higher education. But just as it's true in the industrial workplace, unions can grow stale. It's not always easy to replace the founding generation that actually creates a union out of a sense of passion and broad social commitment. We know that unions can devolve into wage and benefit negotiating instruments and lose sight of a larger social mission. Both things happen in higher education. That is, there are unions that have lost the sense of broad social commitment that was part of their founding initiative, and you see some unions being revived and some local organizing efforts taking on a broader social mission. As a whole, I think academic collective bargaining needs to be redeemed. It needs to be socially committed. It needs to be committed to the welfare of its whole community, the campus community and the community outside it. I mean, higher education in some places is the major industry, and therefore the standards that a college or university sets are standards that often then apply to other industries and businesses in the community. You can promote fairness and equality and democracy in the whole community if you begin to really display them in a university itself. So there's a real potential there, but many higher education unions are no longer have that kind of commitment. They need to be redeemed, and they need to be taken over by younger generations who believe in unionization as part of a broad social progressive movement, not simply something designed to protect your own interests in a narrow way in higher education. So there's a lot of rebirth and reworking to be done, and I have a lot of contact with unions on both sides of the fence where there's a passionate desire to make a difference in the world, and where there's a passionate desire to secure your salary and benefits, and that's about it. I think there's no way of reviving American unionism without becoming more broadly socially committed. And one of the interesting things about higher education collective bargaining is you do have an educated membership. You do have at least some folks with a strong left commitment. And I think higher education is the industry that has a chance in and of itself to redeem American unionism to become again what it was once dreamed it would be in the 20s and 30s. And if we could do that, we'd be a kind of emblem for the country of what unionization should be. And I think just doing it by example would alone be powerful. But a lot of work needs to be done before that will be true.
What are the liabilities of attempting to launch unionization effort across American higher ed in the midst of the exhaustion and crisis within the American labor movement itself?
Well, I mean, there are obviously legal problems when a series of states are inclined to deny all public employees the right to collective bargaining. I mean, that's been a brutal change in Wisconsin. It's in effect in Ohio with Senate Bill 5. Unfortunately or unfortunately, Kasich, Ohio's governor, was eager to promote legislation that also denied collective bargaining rights to policemen and firemen, something that Scott Walker was not stupid enough to do in Wisconsin. And I think that alone really helps the effort in Ohio to repeal that law. It's on the ballot to repeal the law in November. We are going to be vastly overspent by conservative foundations and the Republican Party at a rate that they will overspend us on advertising 2 to 1 or worse. But we've got a lot of feet on the ground, and I think we might win that fight. And if we win that fight, there'll be a resurgence of unionism in Ohio. If the law is repealed, despite all of the reactionary forces in the state and in the country, unionism will prosper, at least in Ohio. But it's kind of a state-by-state issue. In Florida, there were a series of bills earlier this year that would have really just broken higher education. People fought back. The legislation isn't permanently dead. When the Florida legislature returns, the legislation will come back. Meanwhile, faculty and graduate student unions that had really very small percentages of membership. The faculty unions in Florida mostly had membership of 25%. In the course of the last 6 months, their membership has been built up to 45%. And that's really because of all of the conservative legislation that was on the books. So, a crisis is also an opportunity. There's been more organizing. So, in some ways, I think, except where the law really breaks you, higher education can organize separately, even if many industrial workplaces are, for the time being, lost to unionization. Again, that's relative autonomy of a particular institution. I think collective bargaining can thrive in higher education, even though, its presence in American industry has declined awesomely over the last generation or two.
Hands can do incredible things. They made every sound in this piece of music. But nothing compares to using them to help save a life. If an adult suddenly collapses, call 911, then push hard and fast in the center of their chest until help arrives. It's called hands-only CPR, and it's recommended by the American Heart Association. Visit handsonlycpr.org today. A message from the American Heart Association and the Ad Council.
We're speaking with Cary Nelson on the future of academic freedom.
I wanted to ask a question about the role of students in the process of unionization of higher ed. Recently in Great Britain, the youth movement has raised as one of its rallying cry the establishment of student unions. But in a recent article, British left theorist Mike McNair writes, "The problem of student trade unionism and broad leftism is not just that it does not work, it is that it makes communist or socialist students silence themselves as advocates of a real alternative social order." McNair's argument is that by forcing student energies into immediate union campaigns, they cease to become radical advocates and instead become activists for specific campaigns. So why do you think that students ought to play a role as catalyst and as agent in bringing about the unionization of higher ed?
Well, first of all, one has to separate out graduate students as opposed to undergraduates, because graduate students have powerful reasons to want to be organized. They can't negotiate salary or benefits as individuals. They can't go into a department and, say, I'm going to get an offer from another university. You got to raise my salary. I mean, these things are set collectively for groups. And so they really can only better their working conditions and even secure workplace safety, which is an issue in many labs around the country, by acting collectively. They have no choice. I mean, faculty members may imagine that they can improve their lives just by their own individual negotiating. That's not an opportunity for graduate students. And, there's an old Leninist argument that, by compromising and opting for trade unionism, you provide people with, modest improvements in their lives, which they then tolerate, and they reject more revolutionary options. I mean, certainly I'm often criticized by reviewers who count themselves as more on the left than me, although I notice they're all earning salaries as faculty members, so perhaps not quite the radical revolutionaries they'd like to believe. But I'm often criticized for opting for union organizing when that will not change the fundamental power structures in the country. And, I've stood at the graves of part-time faculty members who were exploited all their lives, and I don't feel waiting for the revolution is the most useful way of dealing with those injustices. Fundamental transformation of American society is certainly desirable, but doesn't seem likely, and hasn't seemed likely throughout my whole life. For a while, it seemed in the 1930s that might be possible, and that was, I think, a tremendously energizing time for people who believed that real revolutionary change, not necessarily violent revolutionary change, but revolutionary change was indeed possible. It was a heady time. To some degree in the 1960s and 70s, that conviction returned. Certainly in the student movements of the 1960s, we felt we might usher in a new world. At the moment, it's certainly with the right ascendant, it really doesn't feel that way. But I think that some people be devoted to more revolutionary demands is a good thing, that it be out there as a goad and a challenge for the society. I've accepted the more modest routes of organizing as my personal solution. But that doesn't mean that I'm not still drawn to a fantasy of more fundamental social change. But I can't adopt the notion that you don't want to improve people's lives because that makes them more tolerant of what are fundamentally unacceptable social conditions. I've taught in New York City, I've taught in Harlem, I've worked with black teenagers. To me, it's not really an acceptable alternative to say, let them go to hell so that eventually they'll resist, so that eventually they'll be so oppressed that they'll fight back. Watching lives be destroyed, waiting for revolution, to me, isn't satisfying.
So you're saying that the organization of higher education, especially where it concerns graduate students and adjuncts, is necessary in order to preserve standards of living and a measure of respect in terms of the kinds of education that teachers can provide to students.
Well, I think if adjuncts don't have enough academic freedom to challenge their students, then higher education has become worth a lot less than it was before. Basically, I can challenge my students in any way that I want to. I'm limited by what I can dream. If I had more radical goals and dreams than I do, maybe I would challenge my students still more. But at least whatever I'm capable of thinking of as a pedagogical possibility, I can put into service. I can make use of that imagining. But a lot of contingent teachers just can't. And that, I think, we need to struggle against that, because otherwise the industry just deteriorates and loses the potential to put any kind of critical pressure on American cultural and political life. Graduate student academic freedom is going to be undermined over the next decade. The assessment movement is going to go after two categories of teachers first. Well, three categories, actually. It's going to go after part-time faculty who can be coerced more easily. It's going to go after graduate employees who are more vulnerable. And it's going to go after a third group, which is anyone who teaches K-12 teachers. Because all of the programs that are devoted to training K-12 teachers are going to see much more state intervention. They already are. They are in Illinois. They are in Texas, predictably, of course. They are in several states in the South. So we're seeing state agencies intervene to produce uniformity, uniform syllabi, uniform exams, much more standardized teaching and education in higher education. that's a kind of wedge place for folks who are behind the assessment movement. Their best opening is to try to regulate and bring conformity to the education of K-12 teachers, since all the case law in the country says that the state has real interest in what and how K-12 children are taught. So the extension of that then is the state perhaps has an interest in how the teachers of K-12 students are themselves educated. So we are going to see, I think, in those three areas in the next decade, increasing attempt to standardize education, and in some real ways to housebreak it.
As a leader of this movement, what do you see to be the cause or motive force of this tendency, and how do you see it as being possibly reversible?
Well, a surveillance culture that believes nothing is useful unless it can be counted and enumerated. Surveillance culture that believes that standardization in thought and education is a cultural desiderata. I mean, I think these kinds of impulses are becoming embedded in the culture in part, and especially in the last decade, in the aftermath of September 11th, when there have been a lot of fundamental changes in how we see the world, and in some of our freedoms have been compromised. Fear has been promoted in many ways, and I think, I've begun to believe that there is real desire amongst conservative political forces in the country to reduce access to higher education, to let fewer people have the ability to go to college and pursue their educations further. I think that's part of the impulse to maintain an increasingly hourglass economy, with the difference between wealth and poverty being exacerbated dramatically. There's, I think, greed of the classes in power has increased dramatically. Lack of social responsibility among the wealthy, I think, is rampant. And I think some of the motivations are really pretty dark. They're not democratic motivations. There's nothing egalitarian, I think, in America's ruling classes these days. And there's no guilt in any of it. I think higher education is paying a price because of that, the culture of greed that's in some ways pervaded the country in the last 20 years.
I wanted to wrap up with a question about your own work on poetry. Mm-hmm. What do you think are the most important political stakes of poetry today?
First of all, when you look around the world, it has often been the case that there are moments in cultures when poetry plays a really significant role in shaping public life. That is not the case at the present time in the United States. It could come back again. Certainly during the Vietnam War, it did in a really major way. Mass poetry readings in front of thousands and thousands of people were, for me, just amazingly galvanizing events. There remain other places in the world, notably Latin America, where poetry, I think, often plays a really major role in defining political commitment for people, in defining their own relationship to it, their own consciousness. So, in given cultures, the influence of poetry comes and goes. I've become increasingly in my own work an archivist, and I'm absolutely fascinated to recover moments in history when poetry played a significant role. I'll just give you an example. In the last few months, I have people all over the world who look for poetry ephemera for me. 30-some people, one in Moscow, one in the Ukraine, one in Tokyo, one in Beijing. I mean, I've developed these connections over several decades. My person in the Ukraine, someone new that I met contact with just a few months ago, had access to the Communist Party archives when the party fell. And what he got out of the Communist Party archives in the Ukraine were the broadsides that the Wehrmacht and the SS distributed during Operation Barbarossa in 1941. And that they were distributing broadsides is no secret. There was a moment of time when the German army was characterizing itself as the liberators of the Ukraine. But they were so addicted to killing and burning that image of them as the liberators couldn't survive too long. In that moment when they thought they would try to win over the Ukrainian population, among the broadsides that they distributed, unbeknownst to me or I think anybody else, were a series of poetry broadsides. The SS commissioned poems in Russian and printed them up and tried to use them to win over the Ukrainian population. The broadsides were typically anti-Semitic. It was, Jews, these communists are Jews, break with them and come with us and free your country. So, I have a box full of 40 brittle, yellowed broadsides that were distributed by the SS and the Wehrmacht in the Ukraine. They have never been mentioned in any historical study that I know. And there's a use of poetry that I think none of us have quite imagined might have been the case. So I've just been interested in discovering moments, especially in 20th century history, when poetry had a presence in social life. And some of those moments are pretty dark. I think the SS commissioning and distribution of anti-Semitic poetry stands pretty high on the list of a frightening use of poetry that people haven't imagined. But I have a couple of dozen little historical moments like that where I've been able to recover documents that haven't really been seen in a long time. And part of what I'm writing about at the moment is, those little windows of time when poetry mattered in ways that we haven't imagined it ever could.
Thank you very much for joining us. We've been speaking with Cary Nelson, who is the president of the AAUP, as well as recent author of No University is an Island, Saving Academic Freedom.
Due out in paperback next month.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
This has been Radical Minds. Tune in to WHPK 88.5 FM Chicago every other Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon for more of the finest left-wing broadcast journalism this side of the AM dial.